Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So in this one, we're going to be doing another counters matchup video. So just like the support one I came out with, support on support counter matchups or support on support violence, however you want to look at it, we're going to be doing one with ADCs. So we're going to be doing supports versus ADCs, essentially what supports counter what ADCs and sort of vice versa. And so we'll be using all the supports that we used in the last video. So we'll be doing every Guardian besides Yorm and Cthulhu, and we'll also be throwing Baron into the mix and also Horus. As for ADCs, we're going to be going over all the ADCs, and we're going to be going over some of the magical ADCs as well, such as your Oleron, your Soul, and your Freya. So let's get this started. First up, we have Sobek. Now, Sobek is really, really good at displacing people, plucking people out of position. So naturally, he's going to be really, really good into characters that really don't have movement abilities, right? Because if they get plucked out of position, or if they get displaced, it's really hard for them to sort of get away, right? And so you have your Artemises, your AMCs, your souls, your Cronoses, all these characters don't really have escapes. So once they get plucked out of position, it's going to be really hard for them to recover, and they can easily get gone on. Now, of course, you do have some characters that have banish alts, like Marty and Freya, that are going to be a little bit more safe than, say, your AMC, for example. And same thing with Kronos, right? He's got his ult that lets him rewind, but it's still going to really affect them. And if you can force out, say, these alts early, like these banish alts early, they're sitting ducks when they come back down. Nut is, or Newt, I should say, is one here that's a little bit on the odd end because she does have a dash, but her dash is more like Merlin Flicker. It's not really too safe. Like, it gets her away a little bit, but not too much. It's not going to be something like, you know, a Heim TP, or maybe that's not a fair assessment, but it's not going to be something like an Uller jump or something like that. That's going to get you a little bit more range. And then speaking of, you know, these characters here, under our neutral category, we're going to have characters that can recover from getting plucked, or that might be a little bit immune to it. So that's where some of these characters come in. Again, your Uller has a jump, Heim has a TP, Charybdis has her 3, even her ult as well. Ishtar has a dash slash sleep, these kinds of things. So that's why these characters are on their neutral. Sobek obviously does disrupt them to some extent, but they can recover from the pluck. In terms of counter Sobek, I think Jingwei is one of the easier ones to understand this because she can get out of his CC, right? Like, if she gets plucked, she can dash away, or if she gets knocked up from his 2, she can dash away. And then, of course, she does have her ult as well to be able to get out. So she's very safe in the Sobek. Like, if you're into a Sobek and you like Jingwei, like, Jingwei is a solid pick. Cupid's a good one because Cupid has an ult that can cripple almost instantaneously, a nice big cripple field, so you can actually catch Sobek while he's plucking. And overall, it's just like a super nice ult to be able to pretty much lock down the Sobek with. Chiron I also put on this list because Chiron has a cleanse, so he's going to be a little bit different from the Cupid in this case. Like, instead of sort of locking down the Sobek for engaging and like punishing him off a counter engage, Chiron is going to prevent the engage by cleansing him or his allies from the pluck. So if you're into a good Chiron player, it can actually be somewhat of a bait to almost pluck him, because if he ones himself, you're sort of a sitting duck, right? It's like plucking somebody that just beads is like you're kind of a sitting duck in that case. So that's why Chiron's on the counter Sobek list. And by the way, for these characters, when we talk about counters and non-counters, just like our last video, we're mostly going to be talking about lockdown or just sort of denial. So that's why I have, like, you know, Sobek's going to counter these because he locks these characters down quite a bit. But in terms of these neutral characters, he doesn't lock them down nearly as much. Locks these guys down because of displacement, and then of course counter Sobek because either they deny his pluck, aka the Chiron, or in the Jingwei, or they have lockdown for the Sobek, which is going to be the Cupid, like heavy lockdown. So that's what I kind of consider to be like counters versus non-counters. And of course, just like the last video, it's best to understand the logic behind this, not necessarily the categorization. So you guys might agree, might disagree with me on some of these things, and that's completely fine. But as long as you understand the logic, you can assess how you would pick against these characters when it comes down to picks and bans, and when you're picking. All right, so next up we have Baron and Sylvanus, and these guys are going to be very similar to Sobek, and I put these guys together because for the most part, and you'll see this a little bit throughout the video, but for the most part, they counter slash get countered by the same characters. They do very similar things even though they have different kits. So let's kind of get into this. Baron and Sylvanus are really good at, just like Sobek, locking down characters that don't really have escapes, whether it's from their pulls, right, Baron ult, or Sylvanus 3, or it's from like the roots. These characters can't really get out of it, or they have a much harder time from getting out of it. So that's why these guys are going to counter practically all the characters that Sobek counters, give or take one. Like, for example, Heim. I have Heim up here because Baron and Sylvanus are very good into him. Just from their sheer amount of CC and lockdown alone. And so, again, once these guys get displaced or just even rooted in place because they have no mobility, no movement abilities, they're going to get locked down by these two characters. These characters are going to be a neutral because, again, if they get displaced or if they get rooted, they have ways to get out of it. Like Uller can get out of Baron CC, can get out of Sylvanus CC, all this kind of jazz. So that's why these characters are going to be a neutral. And just kind of heads up, Charybdis is pretty much going to be a neutral for like every single one. Ever since her 3 change, which allows her to be CC immune before going underground, was actually a really good change for her. And because of that, like, it's just really hard to lock down Charybdis. And on top of that too, you can't really cripple her. Like, you can't cripple her out. It's like a Naja sash, right? Like, you can't cripple Naja out of that ability. The same thing with Charybdis. You can't cripple Charybdis out of that ability. So she's going to be able to be super safe. So she's going to be able to remain neutral throughout all these matchups. And then we have counters. So Chiron, again, he's going to be a big counter to a lot of these characters just because he is denial. He's lockdown denial, so he's really good at, again, cleansing himself out of like Sylvanus CC or out of Baron Root, that kind of stuff, for cleansing allies. And then we also have On Her. So the reason why I put On Her on here is because On Her has his pillar and his CC is a ton, especially for an ADC. And On Her's pillar, especially once you rank it up, is really good at sort of locking down these characters or preventing them from moving. His slow is pretty potent. I think it's about a 40% slow. And it can really screw over characters like Sylvanus, especially if he gets a really nice impale off. So it can be really, really hard for him to sort of like play a little bit. Now, Baron does have a slow cleanse. Keep that in mind. But I think for the most part, Honor's still going to be really good against both of them, because especially if Baron can't get that off, he's kind of stuck in the sands, and it's just really, really hard for him to get out. But unlike Sobek, right, we actually don't have Cupid over here, because Cupid, the reason why I lock Sobek down so hard is because of the cripple. But these characters don't care about cripples because these don't have dashes. So they're not going to care as much about the cripple, and they have decent play in the Cupid, which is why Cupid's a neutral. But besides that, most of these characters are going to be kind of similar to Sobek, except for the On Her and Cupid switch. All right, so next up we have Ares. So the big thing about Ares is Ares has a cripple, and that cripple is through his chains, and that cripple is going to be the big thing of what's going to allow him to lock people down. So he's going to counter pretty much any character that has a dash. That's what he's going to be really good at too. And he's going to be phenomenal into characters that have a dash and don't have CC immunity, such as characters like Cupid, for example, who don't have a CC immune alt, or like Uller, Neath, like these kinds of characters. Ares is very, very good into. Now, you do have some exceptions here, like AMC and Scotty. These characters don't have dashes, but they don't have CC immunity. So Ares, if he wants to, can kind of blink alt them on cooldown. And also, too, if you kind of, here's a little trick, but if you get Gem of Iso Ares chains are really, really good at screwing other characters over, especially the ones without dashes, because they typically have another ability slotted in that slot. Which is going to be like more effective against cripple characters. So if you get that Gem of Iso, it's just extra lockdown from the chain, even though like the cripple's effectively not doing anything. So that's why Ares is going to counter like all these characters, because they all have dashes to, well, most of these characters have dashes to a certain extent, and Ares is going to be able to cancel those out. And of course, some of these don't have CC immune alts. Hui is another good example. In terms of neutrals, again, Charybdis is neutral just because you can't cripple her out of her dash. She has 2 CC immunity abilities that she can do, and she also has beads. So she has 3 ways to, become CC immune. You have Soul, because Ares Chains doesn't do anything. Like, Soul's 3 is not a dash. It's technically like a speed boost, I guess. So it's not going to do anything versus that. Kronos, Oron, same thing with all these characters, even Dawn's has slow immunity to some extent. Artemis is actually really good in the Ares, in my opinion, just because she's like decent at locking them down with her CC, and we'll kind of get more into Artemis later on with some of these others. But the reason why she's under neutral here is just because Ares can stick onto her a little bit too, but she does have a lot of tools to deal with Ares, which is why I have her under neutral. But you could definitely put Artemis on, honestly, like under a counter if you wanted to. I think she does have enough lockdown to be considered a counter to Ares. It's just kind of how you see it. But in terms of characters that counter Ares, I'm gonna go with like Freya and Marty. Now these are a little bit on the weirder end. You may or may not agree with me on this, and that's completely fine. First of all, Marty, I've honestly found it really, really hard to lane against Marty as an Ares. It's just really hard because of, one, is ranged root. I think his root's like 1.8 seconds or something like that too. It's some absurd duration. But he has a ranged root that can really screw over Ares, because Ares doesn't have any movement ability, so he can't get out of a root. And on top of that too, the carpet's slow, like the follow-up carpet slow. It's just really, really good at like sort of locking down Ares. And that's just the hunter, right? That's not even like talking about their support, or who's probably gonna have more CC, or even the jungler that comes over. So that's just coming from a hunter. So I just find it overall really hard to play into Marty, and Marty also doesn't really care about Ares chains, and his ult's like, just really good at getting out of Ares ult too. So overall, I kind of put Marty as a counter to Ares. Freya is a little bit of the same way. Her whoop is really, really good setup. So she can like kind of set up Ares if he kind of gets close, and she is really, really, especially Freya with haste, which you should be going on Freya all the time. she's really good at sticking on to Ares. And again, she doesn't care about his chains. She's gonna heal back through like most of his damage unless like you're Omega Fed on Ares. And then of course like her ult is another banishment. So overall, I think these characters like it can be really hard to play Ares into their kind of counters. And again, you could kind of throw Artemis in there as well if you wanted to. I think that's completely valid. But overall, Ares is going to be really, really good into the characters that have movement abilities and rely off movement abilities to do stuff. And obviously also characters that don't have CC immune ults because he can either burn their beads on cooldown or he just gets a free pull on them. Very similar to Ares, we have Artio. Going to be the same exact logic with Ares. She has a big cripple field, and so she's going to lock down anybody that really relies off a dash. But Artio is going to be a little bit more versatile. Artio herself does have a dash, and she also has stuns, and she even has a slow to a root. So she's still going to be a bit more effective against characters that don't have escapes, don't have mobility, than say Ares would be, because she has a little bit more lockdown than Ares does. So just like, you know, going under counters, just like Ares, she's going to counter pretty much anybody that has a dash, right? In terms of neutral matchups, these are all going to kind of remain neutral. She's like good into them. They're not the best into her, but like just like we saw earlier with Freya and Marty, how they countered Ares, they're going to be more of a neutral matchup than Artio because Artio actually has good play around them. She doesn't get locked down by them nearly as hard as say Ares would. And same thing with like Artemis too. Overall, I personally like I play a lot of Artio. I've been playing Artio for a while, and I don't really think that any hunters hard counter Artio. If you were gonna kind of give me one or two, I'd say maybe the Cupid because of the big cripple field, and potentially the Artemis just because Artemis has a ton of CC. But overall, like there's no matchup where I play Artio where I feel like super bad into really any of the hunters. Like I love playing into these kinds of hunters, but in terms of these hunters, doesn't really like it can go either way. It doesn't feel the worst. All right, so next up we have Athena. So Athena is really good at engaging, right? She has her dash taunt, which is one of the best engages in the entire game, and it has been for years at this point. But Athena, to me, like, and I said this in my other video, doesn't really feel like she counters many people. She is really good at engaging, but she doesn't really strike me as like a hard counter character. Like, oh, I counter you because I deny you all this stuff. She's just like, I dash taunt you. I have extremely good setup, and there we go. So she doesn't really strike me as someone who's going to counter really like hard counter characters, which is why I have like most of these characters in neutral because it's more of like a neutral matchup at that point. Like Athena's not going to hard counter them, and obviously they're not going to really hard counter her. So it kind of like the feeling's mutual at this point, right? It's neutral. But in terms of counters Athena, I think there are quite a few characters that are good into it. So first off is Freya, and Freya can counter because Freya has a whoop, and that whoop is really nice entry denial. So Athena wants to dash in and taunt, right? The second Athena dashes in, Freya's going to whoop her if she has good reaction time, and that's going to lock down Athena's dash taunt, and then actually set up Athena because that's the enemy team's going to counter engage off that and set up Athena to actually die, right? Artemis is the same exact thing, but does it in a different way. The Athena wants to dash in. If she dashes in on Artemis, Artemis can ult the dash, and pretty much ult the taunt because she's CC immune. She can stun the Athena and then put a root cripple under the Athena, and like now Athena's kind of getting hard counter engaged on, right? I'll go over on her in a second. I have Chiron on here because it's the same exact thing but a little bit differently. Instead of like CCing the Athena dash goes into a dash taunt, Chiron is just going to go ahead and cleanse it, right? And so like immune the taunt. So all three of these characters are like super heavily like counter engage. The reason why I have on her on here is because if you have a cracked enough on her, like Athena's taunt can't go through walls or player made objects. So if you have a cracked enough on her, like if she dashes in, he can kind of like pillar himself between the Athena and himself or a teammate and block the Athena taunt with his pillar. So that's kind of why I have a on her on there. I know it's a little bit stretching it. I would mainly focus on the Freya, the Artemis, and the Chiron. But you can definitely do that if you're cracked enough with honor or have a cracked enough on her on your team. So just kind of keep that in mind. But yeah, overall, I don't think Athena's really going to hard counter anybody. She's mostly going to remain neutral onto these matchups. And then when it comes to characters that counter Athena, a lot of it's just going to be like denial of her dash taunt in some way, shape, or form. It's going to mostly be these four characters. So up next, we have Atlas. And Atlas is a little similar to characters like Sobek and Sylvanus and Baron in the sense that he is good at locking down characters that don't have as much mobility because he has his grab, right, his pluck, and he also has a lot of slow effects. So characters that don't have, it's kind of like roots, right? Like if you don't have mobility and you're getting like perma-slowed, it's that CC is going to feel a lot heavier to you. Whereas say if, for example, you're playing Medusa and you get slowed, you can kind of like dash away, you know? So you can kind of like increase the gap a little bit. But Alice is going to be able to lock down those kinds of characters pretty well. So that's why under counters, we have a lot of characters that can't really get out of Atlas nearly as much without, say, like, for example, committing an ult to it. But say, for example, like Kronos, Marty, Oleron, Donza, Scotty, like all these characters kind of get screwed over by Atlas, especially ones that's slow, because Atlas is slow immune. It makes his allies slow immune. So like Marty Carpet, Atlas doesn't care about that, right? In fact, Atlas likes that because he gets to immune it. So I think he's going to counter all these characters. Now, Newt, again, very similar case. The thing about Newt is that her dash is just a more short range dash. And so she can still get like super heavily locked down, in my opinion, by Atlas because the dash is so short. And the dash also slows the enemy. And again, Atlas doesn't really care about the slow at all. So overall, I think Atlas is going to be really good into like these 6 characters. And then these other ones are going to be more of a neutral matchup. Artemis, I think you could actually throw under counters just because Artemis, again, does have heavier lockdown. But the reason I don't have her under counters is because same thing with AMC, because AMC also has a cripple and Atlas like hates cripples. But the reason why I don't have these under counters is because Atlas can also play pretty well into them, right? Like Artemis doesn't have an escape just like these characters above, but she is loaded with like way more CC. So if Atlas does get the upper hand on the Artemis, he can actually lock her down pretty heavily. Same thing with the AMC. So that's why these characters are kind of under neutral. And then of course you have like your other base characters as well. In terms of counters Atlas, it's going to be the Cupid. Again, Cupid's just really good at locking down frontline because of that massive cripple slow field that he has. So especially if Atlas tries to disengage or dash away from a fight, his dash is super easily catchable. So Cupid's going to be really good into him, and he has a dash to get away. Chiron, because Chiron has a cleanse. And then Jingwei, because Jingwei has a lot of forms of escapes. And of course, Atlas's main lockdown, right, is going to be his 2, but his 2 is a knock-up, or it's a grab into like a throw, which is also like a pretty much like a knockback, I guess. So Jingwei is going to be able to fly past that heavy engaged CC that Atlas has. So overall, I think these are like going to be good characters to play into Atlas. And then these are going to be really good characters that Atlas loves to play into. And then these, they don't really care one way or the other. Okay, let's go over Bacchus and Charon. So I just want to get these 2 characters out of the way. If you guys have been watching my videos, you know I think Bacchus is just absolutely terrible. I think Charon is also really bad. So these characters don't really have any special lockdown. They're not going to counter anybody. Like, they're just not. Most of these are going to be neutral matchups. Like, it's going to be based off, like, who's going to be, like, more fed, all this kind of jazz, like, one way of the spectrum. And then in terms of counters, Artemis and Cupid, just because they have a lot of lockdown, Artemis can easily catch dash because both their dashes are kind of slow. Bacchus' dash is a little bit on the shorter end when it comes to a dash, kind of like Newt's almost. Charon's dash is going to be on the more like slow end. And so Artemis can catch those, and she has cripples. Cupid obviously easily catches both of those. And then on her, I like on her into them because on her also has his pillar, and he can kind of like catch Bacchus and Charon, I think, a little bit with his pillar. So overall, I think these 3 are going to be really good into them. And then someone like whereas Chiron, for example, wouldn't even be a counter because these guys don't even have that much CC. So overall, like these 2 characters I think are really bad, at least right now. Charon did have his moment to shine way back when. He used to do a lot of damage, but ever since they nerfed his damage, like you just play him in mid lane. Bacchus never really been a good support. He's always been more of a soul laner. So these 2 are going to be kind of like trash. I just wouldn't play them at all if you do want to win. If you just want to play them for their kits, go for it. But if you want to win, play something else. So next up we have Cerberus, and this is looking very similar to the Bacchus and Charon one that we just did, minus the on her here, and instead we have Chiron. Cerberus doesn't, he's kind of like Athena, like he's got a lot of good stuff, but in terms of like ADCs, he doesn't really feel like he counters ADCs like heavily. He's kind of just there to be like Cerberus. Like he's good, he's a good character. In fact, I lose against Cerberus quite a bit. I think he's a good support right now, but like he's not really gonna hard counter any characters. If you could make an argument same for like more magical ADCs, because Cerberus, you know, takes away a lot of their healing and gives it to himself, and so magical ADCs tend to have more lifesteal. I think they just have like more items that they can build that just have lifesteal on them. So like Soul, Freya, Oleron, all those kinds of characters are going to like have more lifesteal. So you could like make an argument for saying Cerberus is good against them. But for the most part, no, I think it's mostly just neutral matchups. And then when it comes to counters, again, it's gonna be the same thing, right? Cupid, Artemis, Cerberus hates cripples. And so like these 2 characters are just gonna be phenomenal into him. And then Chiron, It's just, you know, really good at cleansing. So Chiron's gonna be able to say cleanse Cerberus ult and do all this kind of jazz. So that's kind of why I have these where I have them. So Fafnir is a very interesting one because Fafnir is pretty much made to counter ADCs, or he's pretty much built to counter auto attackers. See, the thing that Fafnir does really, really well is preventing auto attackers. Well, it's locked down onto people because he has a lot of stuns, but overall, his kit's really good at preventing auto attackers from doing what auto attackers want to do, and that's auto attack. That's why Fafnir is really, really good into AA jungle characters, especially like Kali and like Erlong and all those kinds of characters. Like, he loves playing into them. Same thing with soul laners that are more AA based, like Osiris and like Bologna and all that kind of stuff. And the reason being is because not only does he have his hammer, but he also has his 3, which is a disarms, 2-second disarm. It's very, very effective. And of course, disarms prevent you from auto attacking. So Fafnir is, again, pretty much built to counter auto attackers. So he's going to counter practically like all these characters, like all the hunters, because they're primarily auto attackers. The ones I say he doesn't really counter as much are going to be ones that are more ability based. So still, you know, rely off auto attacks to a certain extent. We're all hunters at the end of the day, but they're going to be more ability based. Like Uller, Neith, Marty, and Chiron are more ability based hunters. Uller, fun fact, actually can cleanse disarms if he stance switches. So if you actually get disarmed by Fafnir, and you stance switch, say, to axe or bow form, just the opposite stance that you're currently in, you actually cleanse the disarm off yourself. So that's like a super fun fact if you guys didn't know that. But yeah, these characters are going to be more ability based. I know Medusa is a bit more ability based as well, but Medusa still definitely relies off her auto attacks quite a bit, like her Viper shots, for example. You know, she has her acid spray, she has her, I think it's lacerate, which is her 3, and then she of course has her ults. So, and she does go bluestone, so she is more of an ability based hunter, but she also relies a lot on her auto attacks because her 1 is a stim. So that's where a lot of her damage is going to be coming from, especially to tanks, which is why she's kind of up here as well. In terms of characters that counter Fafnir, Fafnir very susceptible to cripples. So it's gonna be mostly your Cupid, your AMC, and your Artemis, especially after transform. If you get Cupid ulted, or Artemis can put a trap right under your transform, it's gonna be really, really hard. Artemis is, I'd say, probably the hardest counter out of all of these into Fafnir. And then maybe like Cupid, then like AMC. AMC isn't really the best right now, but like nonetheless, he is a pretty decent counter into Fafnir. So that's kind of where I would rate all these characters on this. Another one that I would say is also very good and pretty much made to counter ADCs is Xing. Now, Xing does it in a bit of a different way than Fafnir. So Fafnir is a CC, but Xing is auto attack reduction. So Xing's 1, aside from doing max HP damage, reduces anybody's auto attacks by 50%, which is a ton. But by 50% if he hits them with his 1 for about 4 to 5 seconds or so. I think it's 4 seconds. And so that's going to be insane into any auto attacker. So that's why I have all these characters up here. I have these under neutral more because they do have like decent play on the Xing, right? Artemis has like a lot of lockdown for him. Uller, and some of these are more ability based, like Neith, Marty. Uller is a bit more ability based, so they're not going to rely nearly as heavily on auto attacks. Cupid's going to have some lockdown for him, and of course, AMC is going to have a little bit of lockdown and is a little bit more ability based. In terms of counters, I have one mainly. That's going to be Chiron. Chiron can cleanse himself out of the slow, or not the slow, sorry. Chiron can cleanse himself out of the ult that Xing has. And on top of that, he's just primarily ability based, right? So like he's not going to be nearly as affected into Xing as like these characters up here would be, because these characters are going to be mostly primarily auto attack based characters. All right, so next up we have Ymir, Yemoja, and Cabrakan. We have a triple here. And the reason being is because we're mostly going to be looking at their walls. So all 3 of these characters have walls, right? Like Ymir has his 1, Yemoja has her ult, and her Riptide, which is not really a wall, but it kind of does almost the same thing. It kind of like zones and blocks off a certain area. And then we have Cabrakan with his ult. And so all 3 of these characters are primarily going to counter ADCs that don't have leaps, don't have escapes because they don't have leaps, and overall are just going to be able to get locked down by them. So going into the counters list, we have Newt, Artemis, Sol, AMC, Hachi, Kronos, Medusa, Scotty, Surin, Oleron, X-Ball, Danza, Chiron, Freya, and Cupid. All these characters, or sorry, none of these characters have leaps. All of them have either dashes or don't have dashes at all, which is going to be really, really good. Now, Newt is, she's been like the exception, I think, on a lot of these matchups, because Newt technically can teleport through the walls, but it's a super short range teleport. I can't stress that enough. And it doesn't, like, it's an escape, sure, but doesn't really feel like too much of an escape at the end of the day, which is why she's going to be up here as well. But overall, these characters can't really get out of any of these walls that Ymir, Yemoja, and Cabrakan are going to have, which is going to be really, really huge. Besides maybe even like wasting an ult, right? Like Freya might waste an ult, but like they're really good in say Danza because you can even block Danza Rocket with the wall and make it blow up. In terms of the neutral matchups, it's going to be, well, pretty much the opposite, right? This is going to be characters that can get out of the walls or do have leaps or do have some form of like safety while they're sort of like kind of getting boxed in by these three over here. In terms of counters to Ymir, Yemoja, and Cab, we have On Her and Neith. Neith, because Neith has a lot of CC, especially her root. Her root is actually super potent. It's like a 2-second root. And none of these characters, like Ymir, Yemoja, Cabrakan, none of them have dashes or escapes. They're not as mobile. Sure, Yemoja has her hoops, but she has to walk to the hoop. Cabrakan does have an immunity to Neith's root. If he has it up, then it's completely fine. But overall, if he doesn't have it up and Ymir doesn't have anything like that, Neith is going to be able to lock these characters kind of in place where other people can kind of wail on them a little bit, let's say. And that's why I kind of have like Neith as sort of a counter. And of course, she has a backflip to be able to get over the walls. Now, On Her is going to be a little bit similar and different. So On Her has a lot of CC, especially with this pillar. His pillar actually, if there's another cool On Her trick, but if you use the pillar correctly, you can block off Yemoja's escape with a Riptide, because if you put a wall in front of Yemoja's Riptide, she's going to hit the wall and flatten like a pancake and then just kind of fall down. And so On Her actually has some counterplay to them. And of course, he has a leap to get over their walls and has some extra CC immunity with his ult. And the big thing too is that some of these characters need to kind of get close to do stuff. Like Cabrakan, the thing about Cabrakan is that he's really good. He's actually super strong right now. I highly recommend playing him. But the thing about Cabrakan is that he has to get close to do a lot of stuff. Like most of his abilities, especially his lockdown, is going to be like literally right up in his face. Like he has to be in your face to do something. On Her is really good at punishing that because he's good at pushing people away, right? He's got his leap, which is a knockback. He's got his impale, which is a pushback to a stun if you like hit the wall with it. So On Her has a lot of play into the Cabrakan. So overall, that's why I would kind of put On Her here. His kit is actually like really good at sort of like messing and screwing around with these characters and getting them out of their lockdown. Overall, though, that's kind of where I would put these. All right, next up we have Kumba and Terra, and this is kind of like a theme for these matchups, but they're really good at sort of like locking, just say characters down in general, especially characters that don't have mobility. That's the theme, right? Like no mobility. Oh no, right? You're gonna get locked down. They're really good at doing that, and I'll explain Kumba in a second. But and then they're really bad against like cripples and like a lot of lockdown CC, especially with Terra, because she's more telegraphed on what she wants to do, right? She wants to 1-3 somebody some of the time, and so like for example, Artemis can put a trap down under the 3. But because of that, they're gonna counter characters that don't really have escapes again, right? So like the Marnies, the Olerons, the Scotties, the AMCs, the Danzas, all that kind of jazz. Especially the Heim too. They have a lot of CC to stop Heim from portaling out if his crystal's like far enough and stuff like that. And then of course Newt, because her dash is very, very short. Now the thing about Kumba is that Kumba's 2 is a root cripple. So you would ask me, well, Dash, he has a cripple, doesn't that mean he counters all mobile characters? And yes, that's definitely a true thing. The thing about Kumba is the Groggly Strike, which I believe is the name of the 2, horrendous name, is as bad as it sounds. The thing about Kumba is his 2 takes 2 seconds to wind up. It's not instantaneous. It literally takes like 2 seconds. I've literally like counted in my head and it took 2 seconds to wind up. So yes, if you nail it down, you can turn any mobile character into an immobile character for 2 seconds because they're crippled. And so like they're just kind of rooted in place. But they have 2 seconds to react to that, right? Unless like you're 80, 90 years old, 100 years old, you're going to be able to react to that. And so that's why I say he's really good against immobile characters, because like they can't just dash away while Kumba's charging up his Groggly Strike, right? Like they have to walk away because they don't have any mobility. And so Kumba can just kind of root them. That's why I kind of put Kumba with the Terra here, because it's a little bit of the same thing, but like in theory, yes. In theory, yes, Kumba does sort of counter mobile characters, but in practicality, like in reality, Kumba can't really get it off because then they'll just reaction dashes too. So that's why these characters are under neutral, and that's why I have Kumba really just focusing on characters that are a little bit more tough to get away from. Newt is the exception because Newt's dash is pretty short. So I'm pretty sure, I haven't measured the distance, but I'm pretty sure if Kumba's like charging up his 2 and Newt dashes away, like I'm pretty sure he's still going to be able to catch her with that. Just depending on how close he is to her. Like if he was really close to her and then does it, I'm pretty sure he can catch her with that. And then, so that's why these characters are under neutral, and that's why we have these under counters. Now, in terms of characters that counter Terra and Kumba, it's going to be your same, like your Cupid, of course, right? The cripple field's going to absolutely tear it to shreds. Try saying that fast. Just like, you know, Artio would be in that kind of matchup, or Artemis, for example, putting the trap down and stunning him. And then, of course, Chiron, just because Chiron can cleanse himself, right? Like Kumba 2's the Chiron, or whatever the case, Chiron cleanse himself or can pre-cleanse himself, that kind of jazz. So that's why these characters I have under counters. All right, next up we have Maui. So Maui's a good one. Maui is really, really good. Maui specializes in locking down, but in a weird way. So Maui's biggest thing is displacement. And I went over this in my other video. Maui has the most displacement abilities out of any one character in the game, I'm pretty sure. His passive is a displacement, his 1 is a displacement, and of course his ult is a massive displacement. And on top of that, he has a stun. So Maui's rocking like 4 CC abilities, guys. And I guess technically like his 2 displaces your ally to you. So maybe that's another displacement. Maybe we count that. But in terms of just matchups here, Maui's going to be really good against characters that don't have escapes nearly as much. But he can also like kind of pull people to him. So when you look at counters, again, a lot of these characters don't have escapes. AMC, Scotty, Oleron, Marty. And then you have Newt, whose escape is fairly short. But Maui's going to be able to say ult these guys, right? Especially if they don't have beads. Like hopefully you don't miss it, but you can ult these guys and like get them every single time, especially like Oleron. And fun fact too, if you swing an Oleron ult as Maui, like your 3 is longer. It's a lot longer in Oleron ult. So like you can actually, it's like who ye jump if you jump in Oleron ult. So you can actually stay in the air for a longer period of time. But so we're gonna have these characters that Maui sort of counters. Neutral characters are gonna be more characters that can kind of get out a little bit easier, get out of the CC. I have Freya under here, even though she doesn't technically like have a direct escape unless she ults, just because Freya has a whoop, has a little bit of self CC, and can kind of like cancel Maui from say like wanting her and doing all that kind of jazz. And same thing with like Kronos with the stun and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, yeah, these are all going to be under neutral. And then in terms of counters, Maui hates cripples. I would go with Cupid, just because Cupid can prevent him from jumping. You can counteract the ult from each other. Like Maui could ult Cupid ult, that's completely fine. But I think overall, like Cupid is just really, really annoying into Maui. If you can prevent him from getting his jump off, it's like you need to do that. And then we have Chiron. Chiron is going to be really, really good at cleansing, right? Cleansing Maui out of his 1, out of his 3. Because it's all telegraph CC. All of Maui CC is telegraphed. Even the ult cleanses the ult too. So overall, like these are going to be my like counters. That counter Maui, these are going to be my characters that Maui counters, and then of course these are going to be more of like the neutral matchups. All right, up next we have Kuzenbo. Now this one's might rattle a few heads, might create some discussions in the comment section. Completely fine, I'm all for discussions. I don't actually think Kuzenbo directly counters anybody. I know, like, so Kuzenbo's whole vibe, right, is one, the biggest troll in Smite of a character. I don't know, a bigger troll, maybe you guys do. Maybe it's Kumba, but let's just go with Kuzenbo. But Kuzenbo's whole vibe is reflect, right? Kuzenbo loves to reflect damage. And it's not just auto attack reflect too. He's really good at reflecting ability-based damage too, right? Like a Scylla ulti and you pop your 2, that's a lot of damage. That's 35% right back at the Scylla. So Kuzenbo is really, really good at reflecting damage. And so naturally, he's been really, really good into ADCs, because ADCs especially have a lot of high damage towards single targets. The way I like to think of it is like mages have more damage in an area, like spread out, AoE, splash damage, whatever you want to call it. And then ADCs have more damage to a single target, which is why they're so good at killing tanks. But Kuzenbo, I think, doesn't counter anybody because I'm mostly talking in terms of like lockdown. The way I look at Kuzenbo is like he's just an annoyance more than he is a counter. Like he's good into all these characters, which is why I like they're under neutral. Like he's solid into every single character here, especially because he can pop his 2 while being CC'd. So like he can solo all these characters if he wants to. But like at the end of the day, Kuzenbo doesn't really lock down enough for me to put any of these characters under like, oh, he obviously counters these because he locks these characters down to this extent. That's why I kind of have them under neutral. So even though, yes, he can like kill them with reflect, I mean, he can do that with practically anybody in the game, right? Not just ADCs. For the most part, I would just kind of keep him in neutral. Now for Jingwei, so Kuzenbo is like especially good into crit, right? Like especially if you're building like Nemean, which is back in the game. Nemean's trash, by the way. It's only like 15% like reflect. You hardly feel it. I would never go Nemean unless it's on like Kuzenbo. But you could build like Nemean, you could build Thorns, and Thorns, like, you know, is more explosion now. It's not even like direct reflect anymore. But I think you could say he's a counter to Jingwei a little bit, just because Jingwei has built-in crit, and Jingwei wants to go crit, and Kuzenbo's like especially good into crit. But like even then, a lot of these characters can like heal it back up, with especially with like Asi being like meta hunter build now, and some like the lifesteal items. And there's just so much to it. Jingwei can fly out of his ult, so it's like just leave him under neutral. That's what I would do. In terms of counters, Kuzenbo, I'd say Cupid and Artemis for the most part. Kuzenbo again hates cripples. He relies off his dash a ton. And so, like, Cupid and Artemis, I think, are characters that are really good at sort of, like, locking him down and preventing him from using that ability because they both have cripples. Up next, we have Khepri. Now, just like my support counters video, Khepri, I said, doesn't really counter anybody, and I love playing Khepri. Like, Khepri is my character. Yeah, it's the same thing. Khepri doesn't directly... Khepri specializes in buffing your allies and, like, locking down a single target with his one. Of course, like, setting up / peeling with that. But he specializes in making your ally take reduced damage and then reviving your allies as well. And then, of course, like setting up and peeling a little bit. But he doesn't have like too much lockdown where I can say he really locks down a single character, especially not an ADC, because if he does pluck an ADC, they can just kind of auto him, which I kind of want him to get a disarm in that one. But yeah, it's all right. But yeah, so like for the most part, like he's not going to directly counter any of the ADCs, in my opinion. So they're going to mostly remain under neutral. In terms of counters Khepri, you're Cupid, of course, right? Like you're... Cupid has a massive cripple, and then on her, because, and I said this in my last video, but Khepri has like a really big body, and it's really hard for him to get around player-made walls, especially in the jungle, because he's like one of the biggest, he has one of the biggest bodies in Smite. And so on her, putting up pillars and stuff like that can make it really easy to trap Khepri into places, especially with like the slow too. It can be really easy to sort of bully Khepri. So that's why I would kind of put on her under a Khepri, like counters Khepri, because like I think just about any character that can summon a wall is going to be really, really good into Khepri and prevent him from really like moving around as much as he wants to. You could have some characters like some other ones that also counter, like for example Chiron. Like Chiron can cleanse the Khepri pluck. That's completely valid, and I can completely understand if you want to put that under counters. And the other thing too is that Khepri does have a ranged root, so you could like theoretically say, oh well, what about Khepri being able to root Freya, right? Wouldn't that be a counter? Like, wouldn't that be a good Khepri counter up here? And that's true. Like, if he roots targets that are immobile, they can't move. But it's not like nearly as effective, I think, as some of these other roots. Like the combos aren't. And like typically with this follow-up CC, they can kind of interrupt it. Like Freya can like whoop and all that kind of stuff. So I just kind of have all this under neutral. And yeah, for the most part, I think this would be my list for Khepri versus ADCs. All right, so up next we have Geb. Now Geb is actually really, really good at locking down, sort of not locking down, but cleansing characters that have single target CC. So Geb doesn't have like a tremendous amount of lockdown. Like he has a little bit, right? Like his ult's really good, but the big thing about his ult is the fact that it is a 2-second stun with a whole bunch of damage. Like Geb actually does a pretty decent amount of damage right now. So Geb's gonna be able to do a lot of damage with a stun, and his 2 is pretty disruptive. His 2 isn't really lockdown; it's a mini knockup, but it's disruptive, right? But Geb's big thing, I think, at least for me, when it comes down to these matchups, is gonna be the shield. And so the shield is obviously going to give your ally or yourself HP, but also cleanse. And so he's really good at cleansing single target CC. So for example, Heim, you can cleanse his ult, right? If I don't know if you guys have ever done this. I have before. It's super awesome once you get it, super fulfilling. But if Heim ults an ally, you actually have a pretty solid window there to shield your ally and cleanse them of the Heim ult. And so I actually think Geb's like pretty decent in Heim, because it's actually hard for Heim to get an ult off onto your ally because of that. And then same thing with like Uller. Like if Uller acts as your ally, just cleanse it, right? With the shield. Then like now they get a shield, and Uller, it's gonna be a lot harder for him to hit the combo. And then Geb's always been good in the Chronos, because with Chronos you just shield the stun. So the stun is like a slow to a stun essentially. So like when Chronos initially hits it, you just like cleanse the rest of the portion off, and you're good to go onto yourself or onto your ally. So Geb's gonna counter all 3 of these characters because he can cleanse their CC. He's going to remain neutral on a lot of these characters because they either A, don't have a lot of CC, or B, like Geb's kind of indifferent with these. Like he's just going to do the same which he does the regular characters, which is just kind of like ult, do some damage and all that kind of jazz. One thing to note is that I do have Jingwei down here. Now Geb's passive is kind of like a spectral, and I mentioned this before, but Jingwei kind of likes to build into crit a lot because she has enhanced auto attacks with her too, like to do more damage, and of course she has crit on those auto attacks, so she gets like base crit in her kit. So she wants to itemize into crit. Geb has a pretty much a spectral, and if you build spectral on Geb, I think it actually goes to the point where like Jingwei can't even crit you, which is kind of cool unless she builds like Deathbringer or something like that. So like you could make an argument for her being into the counters, but then she also like is really good if he knocks her up, like hits her with a knockup, and then she can just dash right on that. So you know, there's like a lot of like mini pieces here and there, a lot of like counterplay pieces that I'm just gonna be like, okay, we'll just sort of leave her neutral because I think like their kits are pretty like good at sort of canceling each other out. If that makes sense. And then we have counters Geb, and of course, here we're just gonna have Cupid. Cupid just because of the cripple field, it's gonna be really, really crucial, and especially if Geb wants to roll out and get away, and then Cupid just ults him. You also could do a Chiron as well as a counter. I think this is completely valid. Chiron is going to be able to cleanse like Gebald if he sees it coming, which is really, really huge. So you could definitely put Chiron under counters Geb if you wanted to. Next up, we have Ganesh. Now, Ganesh is actually an interesting one because in my support like counter matchups video, I say Ganesh practically counters just about every single support almost. And then there's like no support that, you know, I wouldn't play Ganesh into. Here on the ADC train, I think it's going to be a little bit more neutral because Ganesh is really good at punishing animated abilities, like long animations. For example, Kumba 2, right? We talked about the Groggly Strike earlier, how long that takes. Like, Ganesh is really good at punching that kind of stuff with the silence. And he's just really good at punching abilities in general. He's still good into auto attackers. Like, Ganesh is one of the best all-around peel type support characters, like in terms of, especially in terms of lockdown. But into auto attacks, he's not gonna do nearly as much because if he silences, like, say, a hunter, they're still auto attacking, right? So, like, the best thing that his silence would do in that case is just give 60 pros to everybody, to himself and everybody else around him. But it's not going to be like super heavy lockdown as it would be on maybe some more ability based hunters. So here we actually have Ganesh is going to hard counter, I think, Neith overall. If you get close to Neith, prevent her from using her abilities with your CC, of course. And if she backflips, you pretty much, it's like a little bit slower. You know where she's going to land. Ganesh can just throw an ult right around her. So that's why I have Ganesh under counters Neith. Everybody else I think is going to be mostly neutral. You do obviously have some more ability-based hunters here, like Heim too, and all that kind of stuff. That Ganesh can sort of like cancel out here and there, but I think for the most part, it's going to remain mostly neutral in terms of these matchups. And then you have counters Ganesh. I think the one main one that counters Ganesh super heavily is actually going to be Artemis. I wouldn't say it's a super heavy counter actually, but the thing about Artemis is she does like cleanse slows and become slow immune, I think, for a little bit. So she's gonna be able to like say walk past his ults. Like she'll still take a tick, but like she won't get slowed by it. She also has really good lockdown if Ganesh gets close, so she can ult with Tusky. Tusky is going to go ahead and like stun the Ganesh, then she can like trap the Ganesh and just kind of auto attack him. At that point, his silence can't really like prevent him from getting out of that either. So I think overall Artemis actually has pretty good play into Ganesh. Like she's good at locking him down and not really worrying about Ganesh's lockdown as much. So that's why I would put Artemis under counters. But everybody else I think is more so just a neutral matchup. All right, so last on our list, we have Bacchus and we have Horus. Now, I put these two together because I think that these two sort of counter around the same characters, and they also kind of get countered by the same characters. And, of course, they're sort of neutral into the rest. So they're both really good at diving, okay? They have more, like, telegraph dive. Horus is more telegraph than, say, Bacchus, but they're both extremely good at diving. I think Bacchus is actually, like, one of the best supports in the game right now, as of the making of this video in Season 11, Patch 7. But they're going to be really good into characters, especially ones that don't have movement. Because if you have a movement ability and you, say, see Bacchus flopping or Horus, like, 2ing, you can reaction that and sort of, like, dash away, leap away, that kind of stuff. But if you don't have a movement ability and they kind of get within range of you, you can't really get out of that unless you have some form of CC to peel yourself. So Freya, Oleron, Chronos, Soul, Marty, Scotty, and Danza, it's going to be much harder for them to get out of it. Now, Freya, I think you can make sort of an exception, say maybe she's more of a neutral matchup because of her whoop, and that's completely valid, especially into the Horse. But I think with Bacchus, she can't really whoop the Bacchus when he first flops onto her, and then by the time she like reaches the ground, Bacchus should be almost done, you know, burping to a stun onto her. So it's going to be really, really tough. On top of that, he has anti-heal. So I think for the most part, both of these characters are still like going to be really good into the Freya, which is why I have her up here. But overall, like, these characters don't really have good movement, good escape to get away from them, to get away from their CC. Funny enough, I know we were talking a little bit of smack about Newt's Dash recently, earlier on this video, but it's actually going to be pretty effective here, I think, because it's good at, like, kind of getting away from the Horus too, and even the Bacchus flop as well. It's, like, just enough range to kind of get out of these two abilities. So I think, like, Newt's Dash actually comes in handy in this case, and she's kind of put on a neutral. If she didn't have one, I'd put her under the counters category. And all these other characters are gonna be sort of neutral. You could definitely make a case for Jingwei, right? Jingwei, of course, both these characters have heavy knockups. Bacchus has a knockup, and so does Horus. So you could definitely say like, hey, Jingwei sort of counters these characters in a sense because she can't get locked down by them. That's super valid. That's super true. You can do that if you want. Horus does have a stun, like a hook to a knockup, so Jingwei is gonna take more damage if she doesn't beat that. But you could definitely say like Jingwei is a counter to Bacchus, especially because he's going to engage with his flop, and then Jingwei can just kind of get out of there. But for these other characters, they're all mostly going to remain neutral, I think. Not too much going on with them. In terms of counters, Bacchus and Horus, you have your classic Cupid. Cupid's going to be insane in this case because both of them are relying off dashes to sort of engage, right? That's their CC is movement ability. So Cupid's going to be able to deny that with one click of a 4. And then Artemis is kind of the same way. Bacchus, Horus are a little bit more telegraphed when it comes to CC. So Artemis is going to be able to reaction alt and then sort of like stun both of them, and then like kind of lock them down herself because of her counter engage and her counter CC. So that's why Cupid, Artemis are here. Chiron, of course, we don't really need too much more explanation on this, but he's going to be able to cleanse himself out of the Horse too, out of the Bacchus flop. He's going to be able to reaction cleanse himself out of those and his allies as well. So that's why we have Chiron down here. But yeah, overall, this is kind of where I would put these characters for Bacchus and Horus. I think they're just really, really good at getting onto and sort of sticking onto characters that don't have any mobility, especially because their CC has a little bit of a wind up time. And then characters that have a little bit more mobility can sort of like reaction get away from them. And then of course like cripples and cleanses are sort of their worst nightmare. But yeah, guys, so that's gonna wrap up the video. Thank y'all so much for watching. If you guys do enjoy these videos, just let me know and I'll make a supports versus mid, supports versus solos, and supports versus jungles matchup. I think that could be really, really cool as well. And if you guys like sort of disagree with some of the things I say, that's completely fine. Again, it's more about understanding instead of categorization, and then making up your own minds with the information and knowledge I'm giving you. And if you like, think that maybe a character or someone should be placed in a different category, like by all means comment and we can sort of start a discussion about it. That would be awesome. But overall, I think that's where I would put a lot of these characters and a lot of these matchups. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed, and until the next video, see ya.